74 degrees Celsius in the shade. The asphalt isn't a road anymore, it's black tar that swallows my boots with every step. I walk between the burned-out husks of cars, and some of them still have shapes inside. Dried shapes. People who didn't make it to shelter in time. 96% of humanity died in the first year. Not from the heat, from what people did to each other so they wouldn't be the first to die. I was one of them once. There's a sign ahead, knocked flat, half buried in ash. Shelter 200 capacity. I don't stop to read the rest. I already know how that story ends. I lived it. This time, I decided something different. I decided it's better to be the one who remembers exactly what he doesn't want to become. But before any of that, before the mine, before the bunker, before Taesu and Mirai, there was a version of me that deserved everything that happened to him. My name is Kang Do-hyun. I was 27 years old and I was not a good man. I want to say that clearly, right at the start, because I'm not going to pretend otherwise later. I wasn't some decent guy crushed by bad luck. I was homeless for 3 years before the world ended the first time, and in those 3 years I became something worse than unlucky. There's an old man who used to sit by the subway grate on Jongno 3-ga, the one spot that stayed warm in winter because of the heating vents underneath. I fought him for that spot. Not argued, fought. I hit him twice, hard enough that he didn't come back the next night, and I told myself he probably found somewhere else. I never checked. I stole food from people who had less than I did. A kid, maybe 19, sharing a convenience store rice ball with his girlfriend under a bridge, I took it from his hands while he was sleeping. I drank whatever I could get. When I was drunk enough, I picked fights with strangers just to feel like I had power over something. This is who I was. Not a victim of the world, a product of it, and then a contributor to it. So when the world actually started dying, I didn't stand a chance, and honestly, some part of me thought I deserved that. The first collapse came fast, 15 degrees Celsius in 1 month. Nobody believed the news at first. Heat waves happen, everyone said. This is just a bad one. Then the power grid started failing because half the planet ran their air conditioners at once, and the temperature kept climbing, and nobody was laughing anymore. I didn't die in the first week. I want that on record too. I wasn't weak, not in the way people think. I lasted 11 days on the street while the city fell apart around me. 11 days of stealing water bottles from people slower than me. 11 days of watching neighbors who'd known each other for a decade turn on one another over a case of bottled water outside a convenience store. I watched a man stab another man for a bag of ice. I watched it, and I didn't feel sick. I felt like I understood the new rules faster than most people, and that made me feel for the first time in years like I was good at something. That feeling didn't save me. On the 11th day, I found a flask, just a metal flask, maybe half a liter, tucked into a dead man's backpack in an alley behind a shuttered pharmacy. I didn't check if he was actually dead before I took it. I didn't have time to care. Half a liter of water. In that heat, it was worth more than my life had been worth to anyone in years. 4 men found me an hour later. They weren't a gang. Not really, just 4 people who used to have jobs and families, now reduced to the same math I'd already done myself. They wanted the flask. I could have given it to them. 4 against 1, no weapon on my side, and I do remember this part clearly. Even now, I remember thinking that if I just handed it over, maybe they'd let me walk away. Maybe I'd find another flask tomorrow. Maybe, but I didn't hand it over. Some ugly, stubborn piece of me that had survived 3 years of losing everything decided that this was the one thing I wasn't going to lose without a fight. I swung the flask at the nearest one and split his lip open, and for about 2 seconds I actually believed I might win. Then someone hit me with a length of rebar and I went down, and they kept hitting me even after I stopped moving. I found out later, much later, in the life that came after this one, that this was common. People didn't just take what they needed anymore. They made sure you couldn't come back for it, and they made sure you couldn't tell anyone where they'd be next. I didn't think about justice while I was dying. I didn't think about God or fate or any of the things people are supposed to think about at the end. I thought about the flask, still half full, rolling out of my hand into the gutter, and how in about 30 seconds one of the 4 men was going to pick it up and drink from it like it meant something. That was the whole lesson of my first life, condensed into the last thing I ever thought as that version of myself. Even while we're dying, we tear each other apart over a liter of water. I didn't get a lesson in courage. I didn't get a lesson in hope. I got exactly one fact. Delivered as hard and flat as the rebar that killed me, the world doesn't run out of decency because people are evil. It runs out because decency is expensive, and when the price gets high enough, almost nobody can afford it. I expected nothing after that. Darkness, maybe. An ending that actually ends. Instead, I woke up in my old apartment, the one I'd lost 2 years before the collapse even started, back when I still had an apartment, back when I still had a job I threw away drinking. The date on my phone screen told me everything I needed to know in half a second. 8 months before July 14th, 8 months before the temperature spike that kills the first wave of the world. I didn't cry. I didn't laugh. I lay there on a mattress I hadn't touched in years, and I did the only thing that felt natural to me anymore. I ran the numbers. 8 months. That's not a gift. That's a deadline. I already knew how this ends if I do nothing different. I know exactly how fast the water runs out, how fast the government shelters turn into slaughterhouses, how fast people I might have called neighbors turn into people holding rebar. I know because I lived through it once, and it killed me over half a liter of water and my own stupid pride. This time isn't going to be about surviving longer than everyone else through luck. Open kindness is a good way to die second instead of first, and I already died first once. I'm not doing that twice. This time, whatever I build has to be invisible before anyone knows to look for it, self-sufficient before anyone can starve it out, and strong enough to survive not just the heat, but the people who come looking for it once the heat has already taken everything else. I get up. My legs are shaking, and it isn't from the room temperature. 8 months. I need money before I need anything else, and I already know exactly where the money is going to come from because I remember every headline this dead world showed me the first time. I remember an underdog fight 3 months from now that nobody expects to go the distance. That's where I'm going to start. I have 8 months, $200 in my wallet, borrowed twice over from people who don't remember lending it to me yet. That's the entire foundation of everything I'm about to build. I don't waste time being grateful for the second chance. Gratitude doesn't buy water filters. Here's the only thought that matters, and I keep coming back to it like a man checking a wound. The strong don't survive what's coming. The prepared do. The ones who hide well enough that nobody thinks to come looking for what they have, those are the ones who make it. Kindness, out in the open, where everyone can see it, is just a slower way of dying first. I already died first once. I'm not doing the math wrong twice. 3 months from now, there's a boxing match nobody cares about. A journeyman named Song Min-jae, 34 years old, fighting a prospect who's undefeated and favored 11-1. I remember it because I watched it in a shelter common room in my old life, half drunk, laughing with everyone else at how badly the old guy got knocked out in the 4th round. Except that's not what happens. I remember it clearer now than I remember most of my actual life. Song slips a big right hand in the 2nd round, the kind of punch that looks careless until it lands, and the prospect goes down and doesn't get up before the count hits 10. Everyone in that shelter room called it a fluke. Nobody made money off it because nobody believed it was coming. I believe it. I lived through the version of the world where it already happened. $200 on an 11-1 underdog. If I'm wrong, if my memory is off by one detail, one name, one fight card, I go back to sleeping in stairwells with nothing. That's the whole bet, not just the money. The 8 months I have left before the temperature spike starts. I place it 3 weeks before the fight, split across 2 different betting shops so nobody remembers my face too well. Then I wait, and waiting is the worst part, because waiting gives me too much time to imagine every way I might have gotten it wrong. I didn't get it wrong. $200 becomes $12,000. There's a bookmaker at the second shop, a heavyset man named Park who took my bet with a smirk he didn't bother hiding. 11-1 on a washed-up 34-year-old, he said, sliding my slip across the counter like it was already trash. Come back next week, I'll buy you a beer for the entertainment. I go back the following week to collect. He doesn't smirk this time. He counts out the cash slower than he needs to, like he's hoping the total will change if he counts it enough times. And when he finally pushes it across the counter, he asks me, flat? No smirk left in his voice at all. How did you know that? I don't answer him. I just take the money and walk out into air that's already 3 degrees hotter than it should be for this time of year, and something in me, some small, ugly, satisfied thing, enjoys the silence behind me more than it should. That's the first time in this life anyone looks at me like I'm not just another guy who's going to disappear. It won't be the last, and I intend to make sure of that. $12,000 isn't enough to build anything. It's enough to not lose everything on the next bet, which is a different thing entirely. I remember a coin. Small, barely traded. The kind of asset that existed for maybe 4 months before some announcement sent it up 900%, and then it died as fast as it rose. I don't remember the exact date it happened. I remember it was sometime in the 2nd month after I found this new life, and that's close enough that I can afford to watch the charts every day and wait for the pattern to start matching my memory. This bet is worse than the fight. A boxing match has 2 outcomes. A coin like this has 1,000 ways to go wrong and 1 way to go right. and I'm betting $12,000 every dollar I have that isn't already spent on food, and a room on my memory of a headline I half read on someone else's cracked phone screen in a shelter that doesn't exist yet. I put it all in anyway, because the alternative is being careful with $12,000 while the clock keeps running toward July 14th, and careful doesn't build a bunker. 6 weeks later, the coin spikes exactly the way I remember. I don't wait for the peak, I sell into the climb, not at the top, because greed is how people who remember the future still manage to lose everything. $12,000 becomes a little over $150,000. I stare at the number on my screen longer than I should. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like the first solid floor I've stood on in years, and I'm almost afraid to put my full weight on it. For exactly one evening, I let myself stop. I rent a small room above a laundromat, nothing special. Just 4 walls that lock from the inside, and a bed that doesn't smell like the street. I buy real food, not the cheapest thing on a shelf, and I eat sitting down slowly, like a person who has time. For maybe 10 minutes, it feels like enough. It feels like I climbed out of something, and I'm allowed to just breathe in the new air for a while. Then the thought comes, quiet and immediate, and it doesn't ask permission. This isn't safety. This is an 8-month head start, and 6 weeks of it are already gone. I finish the food, I go back to work. $150,000 is real money, but it's not bunker money, not the kind of bunker I'm planning, the kind with redundant power, triple filtered air, and walls nobody knows exist. For that, I need millions, and I need them before the world figures out what's coming and the smart money crowds in ahead of me. I know exactly where to put it. I remember the headlines from the year everything fell apart, not the year itself. That's still 8 months off, but the year before it. The year when a handful of companies quietly went from irrelevant to essential because they made the one thing everyone suddenly needed. Desalination systems, industrial-grade air conditioning units, standalone solar arrays, backup generators built for continuous, punishing use rather than a few hours during a blackout. Nobody's paying attention to those stocks yet. The heat hasn't started climbing. The world still thinks this is a normal year with a few bad news cycles. I buy in early and I buy in heavy, spreading the $150,000 across 5 companies instead of betting everything on one, because I've already learned that lesson twice now, once with a flask of water that cost me my life, and once with $200 that could have ended the same way if I'd been wrong about a boxer nobody remembers. Then I wait, and this time waiting doesn't feel like torture. It feels like watching a fuse burn towards something I already know is coming, while everyone else around me is still asleep. By the 3rd month, the heat index starts climbing faster than the news anchors expect. Nobody's panicking yet, they're calling it an unusual summer, a record year, the kind of thing people forget by autumn. But the stocks I bought start moving anyway, slow at first, then faster, because somewhere in the world, people who read the data before anyone else are starting to buy the exact same things I already own. By the time I stop checking the numbers every hour and start checking them once a day instead, because checking them constantly stopped teaching me anything new, the total sitting in my accounts has crossed $4 million. $4 million, 8 months after I woke up with 200 and a memory of one fight nobody else believed in. I don't celebrate. I open a map instead, and I start looking for a piece of land that no real estate listing has ever mentioned, somewhere deep enough, forgotten enough, that when the world burns, nobody will even think to come looking for what I'm about to build there. Part 3. The Mine, the Engineer, and the Sniper. $4 million sitting in an account doesn't stop a single degree of heat. Money only means something once it turns into concrete, steel, and food that doesn't rot. So that's the next move: turn numbers on a screen into something that can actually keep 3 people alive when the sky starts trying to kill everyone. I already know what I'm not buying. There are developers advertising elite bunkers right now, glossy brochures, private tours, armed guards standing at gated show homes so buyers feel like they're purchasing safety instead of just square footage underground. I remember one of them specifically, a place called Halcyon Ridge, marketed as unbreakable. It fell in 6 hours once the collapse hit, because every raider crew within 200 kilometers already knew its exact address from the same brochures that sold it. Advertising a shelter is the same as painting a target on it. I'm not doing that. I spend 3 weeks looking at land through a shell company I set up specifically so my own name never touches a single document. What I find isn't glamorous. It's an abandoned uranium mine cut into the side of a mountain range nobody visits anymore, shut down decades ago when the ore ran too thin to be profitable. 40+ meters of solid rock overhead. At that depth, the ground holds a stable, low temperature no matter what the surface does. 70 degrees up top won't move the needle down there. Better than the depth, though, is the fact that nothing about this place exists on any list anyone checks. No brochure, no sign. Just old mining permits filed under a company that stopped existing before I was born, and a name on a new deed that traces back to a shell corporation 3 layers deep. I buy it in a single transaction, quietly, for less than a third of what a luxury underground listing would have cost me for a fraction of the space. The difference goes straight into what actually matters: the systems that keep people breathing. A bunker built on the wrong land is worthless. A bunker built by the wrong people is just as worthless. I need engineers who won't talk, and I already have 2 names in my head that have been there since the moment I woke up in this second life. Park Tae-soo, first. 41 years old, former military combat engineer, currently working private security jobs nobody remembers his name from. In the life I already lived once, Tae-soo died in the 2nd month of the collapse, not fighting, not running, but carrying an injured child out of a collapsing building while raiders picked off anyone slow enough to catch. He put the child down before he went down himself. I only know that because I heard it secondhand months later from someone who watched it happen and never stopped talking about it like it was the last decent thing they'd seen anyone do. I find him at a construction site on the outskirts of the city, doing structural inspections for a company that underpays him by half of what his skill set is worth. I don't waste his time with a sales pitch. I'm building something, I tell him. Underground, off the books, and I need someone who can make sure it doesn't kill the people inside it before anything outside gets the chance. He looks at me the way people look at anyone who sounds like they might be running a scam. Building what exactly? A shelter that actually works. Not a marketing brochure. I'll pay you enough that you never have to inspect someone else's cracked concrete again, and I'll give you real authority over the engineering, not a security badge, actual control. He asks how I can afford that. I tell him the truth, filtered down to something believable. Good investments, early timing, nothing illegal. It's not a lie technically, it's just not the whole shape of the truth. He takes 3 days to think about it. Then he shows up at the address I gave him with a duffel bag and a set of tools, and that's Tae-soo decided. Han Mi-rae is harder to find because in this life nothing has happened to her yet that would put her name anywhere I can search for it. In the life I lost, Mi-rae survived 2 months completely alone after the collapse, holding a stretch of collapsed highway overpass as her own private territory, killing anyone who came at her wrong twice. Men who thought a woman alone meant an easy target found out otherwise before they finished the thought. She made it 2 months on nothing but nerve and a rifle she taught herself to use after everything else fell apart. Then, her body simply ran out of what it needed and she didn't wake up one morning. Nobody found her for weeks. Right now, in this life, she's 26, working range days at a private shooting club and doing competitive shooting on weekends, completely unremarkable to anyone who doesn't already know what she's capable of under real pressure. I watch 2 of her matches before I approach her, just to confirm the instinct I already trust from a life she hasn't lived yet. I find her after a match, still cooling down, and I don't dress up the offer. I'm not looking for someone to guard a fence, I tell her. I'm building a place that's going to need someone who can hold a line completely alone if it comes to that, but who won't have to, because there'll be a team around her this time. She asks what makes me think she'd ever need to hold a line alone, because everyone's going to need to eventually. I'd rather you not find that out the hard way. It's vague enough that she could walk away thinking I'm just strange. She doesn't walk away. Something in the way I said it lands somewhere she doesn't explain to me, and 2 weeks later she's standing at the mine entrance with a rifle case and no more questions than Tae-soo asked. Construction starts before the crew even finishes settling in. Tae-soo takes one look at the mine's existing shaft layout and redraws half of it within the first week geothermal piping first, a network of lines sunk 80 meters down into the rock to bleed excess heat away from the living spaces instead of relying on compressors that will eventually burn themselves out running non-stop. Power comes next. Solar panels disguised as scrap sheeting bolted to the old mine's derelict surface structure, so from above it reads as junk instead of infrastructure, plus a small hydro turbine fitted into an underground spring Tae-soo finds on the second survey pass, giving us baseline power even on days with no sun at all. The first layer of defense goes in early too, a false tunnel branch, dead-ending 50 meters from the real entrance, rigged with a controlled collapse mechanism that can be triggered from inside if anyone follows it far enough to matter. None of this is cheap, and none of it is fast. $4 million starts looking smaller every week the deeper the excavation goes. 3 weeks into construction, a county inspector shows up at the mine's surface access point, clipboard in hand, asking questions about permits for a project that officially doesn't exist under my name at all. He's not subtle about what he wants. "A lot of activity for an abandoned claim," he says, looking past me at the equipment stage near the entrance. "I could make this go a lot smoother if the paperwork happens to need encouragement." I already knew this moment was coming. Inspectors like this exist everywhere, and a project this size was never going to stay invisible to every single set of eyes. So I hand him a folder instead of an argument. Environmental remediation permits, filed 8 weeks ago under the Shell Company, citing old mine contamination cleanup as the stated purpose. Every document he's about to ask for is already sitting in his own county's records, filed correctly, filed early, filed by someone who assumed exactly this conversation would happen. He flips through it slower than he needs to, looking for a gap that isn't there. There isn't one. "Everything checks out," he finally says, handing the folder back like it cost him something just to admit it. "It usually does," I tell him, "when people plan ahead." He leaves without another word. I watch him go, and I don't feel triumphant about it. I feel like a man who remembered to check a box before someone else could turn it into a problem. That's the entire difference between this life and the last one, condensed into one folder of paperwork nobody else thought to prepare. The one evening we all sit together on the surface. It isn't planned. Tae-soo brings out 3 folding chairs and a case of beer he bought in town. And for maybe 40 minutes, none of us talk about geothermal load calculations or defensive perimeters. Mireille asks how deep the shaft actually goes now. Tae-soo answers with numbers, the way he answers everything, and for a while it's almost comfortable, the kind of quiet that exists between people who've started trusting each other's competence, if not yet each other's reasons. Then Tae-soo asks the question I knew was coming eventually. "How did you know to buy this land before anyone else even thought about heat-resistant stocks? How did you know I'd say yes to a job I'd never heard of from a guy I'd never met?" I take a second longer than I should before answering. "I read a lot," I say, "and I got lucky more than once." It's not an answer, and all 3 of us know it isn't. Mireille glances at me for a second too long, like she's filing the moment away rather than letting it go. Tae-soo doesn't push it further, not tonight, but something in his expression tells me this isn't a question he's finished asking. It's just one he's decided to set down for now. I let the silence sit there instead of filling it. Some debts you don't pay off with an explanation. You pay them off by being right often enough that nobody needs one anymore. 3 months out from July 14th, the mine is loud with work almost around the clock. We've brought in 6 more people by now, 2 technicians for the air filtration systems, a structural crew for the blast doors, and a doctor named Soo-min, who Tae-soo vetted personally after finding her running a free clinic out of a shipping container on the edge of the city, treating patients who couldn't pay for anything better. $4 million has become something closer to a small industrial operation buried inside a mountain, and every week the mine looks less like an abandoned hole and more like something that could actually keep people alive. Then, on a Tuesday evening, one of the newly installed seismic sensors on the outer perimeter, the ones meant to catch tremors, not footsteps, picks up a pattern that doesn't match any tremor at all. Slow, deliberate, spaced out over almost an hour, moving along the tree line half a kilometer from the main entrance. Tae-soo pulls up the readout and doesn't say anything for a long moment. "That's not geology," he finally says. "That's someone walking a perimeter." We're 3 months from the end of the world, and someone out there has already noticed we exist. The temperature spike starts on a Tuesday morning, and for the first 6 hours, nobody outside our mountain treats it like anything more than a bad heat wave. I know better. I've lived through the version where everyone stays calm for exactly 1 day too long. By noon, 3 regional power grids report cascading failures, too many air conditioners drawing too much current at once, transformers cooking themselves faster than crews can replace them. By evening, the news anchors stop using the word unusual and start using the word unprecedented, which is the word people reach for right before they run out of words that sound survivable. We're not watching this from a couch. We're watching it from inside a mountain that isn't finished yet. Tae-soo has the radio running on a loop in the main corridor, not for entertainment, for intelligence. Every hour brings something worse than the hour before it. A city 300 kilometers from us loses power completely and doesn't get it back. A hospital evacuation turns into a stampede when the backup generators fail 4 hours into the crisis instead of the 12 they were rated for. A newscaster reads a death toll for heat-related incidents in a single metro area, then reads a second, much smaller number for incidents involving violence, and I already know which of those 2 numbers is going to flip completely within a week. Soo-min, the doctor, stops what she's doing every time a new report comes through, listening with the particular stillness of someone doing math in her head about how many of those deaths were preventable and how many weren't. "They're not ready," she says at one point, to nobody specifically. "None of them are ready." I don't answer her, because there's nothing to say that isn't already obvious, and because I'm not ready either, not completely, not yet, and that gap between where we are and where we need to be is the only thing that matters right now. Here's the actual problem, laid out the way Tae-soo lays it out for me that afternoon. Blunt and specific because that's the only way he knows how to deliver bad news. The air filtration system isn't fully tested. 2 of the 3 redundant compressor stages are online and verified. The third stage, the one that handles positive pressure sealing against the entrance corridor, the exact thing standing between breathable air and whatever starts drifting down from the surface, once the heat gets bad enough to change what's actually in the atmosphere up there, hasn't finished its pressure testing cycle. At the same time, half the battery bank meant to buffer power during dark stretches isn't installed yet, still sitting in crates near the loading point, and the main entrance blast door has been reinforced on paper but not in steel. The actual armor plating for it is still 2 days from being fully mounted. We don't have enough hands or enough hours to finish both before the world outside gets bad enough to matter. Tae-soo puts it as a straight choice because that's what it actually is. Air system or entrance, he says. Pick one. We can't do both properly before this gets worse. I don't take long to answer because I already know the math from a life that already ended once. Air system. He looks at me for a second like he wants to argue it, because leaving the entrance half-armored while the world outside starts sharpening its knives sounds like the wrong call to a soldier. I understand that instinct. It's not wrong exactly. It's just second in priority. Nobody's coming to break down that door tonight, I tell him. It's day 1. The people who are dangerous enough to matter haven't figured out we exist yet, and even the ones who do won't have the numbers or the organization for weeks. But if that third filtration stage doesn't seal properly and the air outside turns toxic before we fix it, everyone inside this mountain dies slow in their sleep, and no amount of armor on that door saves a single one of them. Death by suffocation moves faster than death by siege. That's not a guess. That's the entire lesson of the world I already watched burn once, and I'm not spending a single hour relearning it the hard way. Tae-soo doesn't argue further. He redirects every spare set of hands to the filtration stage, and the battery installation and the door armor both get pushed back, unfinished, exposed, while we race the clock on the one system that can kill everyone silently if it fails. The perimeter cameras start picking up movement from the small town at the base of the mountain. By the second day, not raiders, not yet, just neighbors. Families loading cars with whatever fits, driving up mountain roads that lead nowhere except higher elevation and slightly cooler air. The same instinct that sent people toward high ground since long before any of them had cars to drive therein. None of them know what's cut into the rock above their heads. From outside, our surface structure still reads exactly the way Tae-soo designed it to read collapsed mining infrastructure. Worthless. Not worth a second look. That's the whole point of building it that way, and for the first time since we started, I watch it actually work. Watch cars pass within a few hundred meters of an entrance none of them can identify as anything but rubble. Mireille watches the same feed from the security station. Rifle case within reach even though there's nothing yet worth aiming at. They're just looking for altitude, she says. They don't know there's anything up here to find. Good, I say. Let's keep it that way as long as we can. The one man who does know is Choi Young-tae, a local businessman who made a small fortune in regional real estate and spent most of last year mocking the abandoned mine renovation project up the mountain to anyone who'd listen at the country club he still visited back when country clubs still made sense as a place to spend an afternoon. I met him twice during the land purchase process, both times through people who worked for the county, both times with him laughing just loud enough for me to hear it. Paranoid hole in the ground, he called it once, to a table of people who all laughed along with him, because that's what you do at a table like that. He shows up at the base of our access road on the third day of the heat spike, in a car that clearly wasn't built for the terrain, banging on the outer gate intercom with both fists. I know you built something up here, he says, voice cracking through the speaker, stripped of every ounce of the confidence he had at that country club table. I know it. I have money I can pay, whatever you're asking, just let me in, please, I have a family. I listened to the whole thing from the security station, and I don't feel the satisfaction I might have expected to feel, watching a man who mocked me beg at my gate. I don't feel anger either. I feel the same cold arithmetic I've felt since the moment I woke up in this life. I don't know this man. I don't know his family, don't know how many people are in that car with him, don't know what he'd cost the system we've built for 11 people currently living inside it on resources calculated for exactly that number and no more. Letting him in isn't kindness, it's an unknown variable, injected into a structure that doesn't have room for unknown variables yet. 3 days into a collapse that's going to get exponentially worse before it gets better. I'm sorry, I tell him through the intercom, and I mean it in the narrow, honest way that doesn't change the answer. I can't let you in. I don't know you, and I don't know what letting you in cost the people who are already inside. He doesn't accept that answer gracefully. He shouts, he threatens, he offers numbers that keep climbing the longer I don't respond, and eventually, because there's nothing else his voice can do against a locked gate and an intercom that's already gone silent, he stops. I watch the camera feed as his car turns around and heads back down the mountain road, taillights shrinking into heat shimmer and dust, and I don't know what happens to him after that. I choose not to find out. That's not cruelty. That's the only way to survive the next decision, and the one after that, and all the ones still coming. By the fourth day, the filtration system's third stage passes its final pressure test at just past midnight. Tai-Su runs the smoke test himself, sealing every joint personally, watching for the faintest trace of leakage at each connection point before he's willing to call it done. There isn't any. The system holds positive pressure exactly the way it's supposed to. We haven't finished the entrance armor, we haven't finished the battery bank, but we can breathe no matter what starts drifting down from a surface that's already 41 degrees hotter than it was 1 week ago, and that's the trade I made, and I'd make it again without hesitating. At 2 a.m. on the 5th day since the spike began, we seal the main blast door for the first time, not because anyone's outside trying to get in yet, but because the surface air quality readings have crossed a threshold none of us want to test our lungs against directly. The door closes with a sound that's less dramatic than I expected, a deep mechanical thud, followed by the pressurized hiss of seals engaging, and then nothing. Complete silence. Inside, 11 people stand in a corridor lit by emergency lighting, listening to that silence settle over everything like it's the first real breath any of us have taken since the world started ending 5 days ago. Tai-Su switches the radio feed to the main speaker instead of his handheld, and for a moment we all just listen to what's happening on the surface. We just sealed ourselves away from a broadcaster's voice, cracking with static and something that might be exhaustion or might be fear, reading emergency numbers that keep climbing city by city, region by region, a world still screaming above 40 meters of solid rock that no longer lets any of that sound reach us directly. Down here, it's quiet enough to hear someone breathing 3 meters away. That contrasts the roar we just shut out and the silence we're standing in now is the first time since I woke up in this life that I let myself believe, even for a moment, that the 8 months of planning bought us something real. I don't say that out loud. I just listen to the quiet and I start thinking about everything that still isn't finished. Tai-Su flies the drone for the first time on day 9, mostly because we need to know what outside actually looks like now, and partly because none of us can stand not knowing much longer. What it shows us isn't a war. It's worse than a war because a war has sides. The nearest government shelter is 40 kilometers east, built into a converted subway maintenance facility that was supposed to hold 2,000 people. The drone footage shows a crowd outside it that looks closer to 5,000, packed shoulder to shoulder in heat that's already climbing past 70 degrees, and the entrance gate isn't opening for any of them. Then it does open, once, just long enough for armed guards to fire into the crowd, not at raiders, not at an attacking force, but at their own countrymen pressing too hard against a gate that physically cannot admit them all. 3 people go down in the footage before the gate closes again. Tai-Su freezes the frame without being asked to, like he doesn't need to see the rest any more than I do. "That's not a shelter," Mireille says, watching over his shoulder. "That's a trap with a line painted on the ground in front of it." Sumin, standing a few steps back, doesn't say anything for a long moment. When she does, her voice is flat in the specific way people get when they're refusing to let themselves feel something yet. "Overcrowding like that? No working sanitation, they'll have dysentery running through that shelter inside 2 weeks? Maybe less." She's not guessing. She's stating a fact the way a doctor states a fact, and none of us argue with it. We watch the footage twice more before Tai-Su pulls the drone back. Nobody asks to see a third pass. The first real test of our own defenses comes 11 days after the door sealed, and it doesn't come from anyone organized. It comes from 3 men and 1 woman, none of them armed with more than a crowbar and a length of pipe, moving along the tree line the way people move when they're following instinct instead of a plan. The same instinct that led half the mountain's evacuees toward higher ground, except these 4 have already run out of whatever they were carrying and started looking for what other people might still have. They find the false shaft entrance the hard way, stumbling onto it more than tracking it, drawn by an air vent Tai-Su hadn't fully camouflaged yet, one of the details still on the unfinished list from the day we chose filtration over the entrance armor. That choice comes back around now, small and specific, exactly the way choices like that always do. Mireille has eyes on them from the security station within 4 minutes, watching them work a crowbar into a seam in the false shaft's outer plating. They're not skilled, she says over the comm. Calm, professional. But they're not giving up either. I make the call from the control room. Let them in the false shaft. Don't engage yet. Taesu doesn't like it. I can hear that in the half-second pause before he answers, but he doesn't argue it either. The false shaft was built for exactly this. Let them commit to the wrong tunnel before anyone spends a single bullet on them. The four of them get 30 meters into the dead-end branch before the lead one, the tallest, moving with the kind of confidence that comes from having survived on instinct so far, realizes the shaft doesn't lead anywhere. By then, it's too late to matter. Taesu triggers the collapse mechanism from the control room, and a section of reinforced ceiling gives way exactly where it was designed to, burying the rearmost few meters of the tunnel in rock and dust. One of them doesn't get clear in time. The other three do, scrambling backward through settling dust and screaming that isn't aimed at anyone, just at the raw fact of watching someone die a few feet away from them. They retreat. Not organized, not tactical, just running. The way people run from something they never understood the shape of until it already had them. It works. That's worth saying plainly, because the plan was built exactly for this scenario and it performed exactly as designed. It's also not clean, not bloodless, not the kind of victory that feels like anything close to satisfaction. One person is dead under several tons of rock because they tried to break into somewhere they didn't understand, and 3 more just watched it happen and ran carrying that with them. I don't feel good about it. I don't feel bad about it either, not in any way that changes what I do again tomorrow. It's just what the door costs when someone tries to open it wrong. The camouflage breach that let them find the vent in the first place turns out to be a small thing, a section of brush covering meant to be replaced weekly that simply wasn't, because every set of hands on the mountain has been pulled toward the filtration system instead. Taesu has it fixed within the hour, but he doesn't pretend the gap wasn't real. "That's on me," he says, kneeling by the reset panel, not looking up. "Should have caught it 3 days ago." "You were finishing the air system," I tell him. "That was the right call. This is the cost of it, not a mistake." He doesn't answer that directly, but he doesn't argue it either, and we both know the distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. Every choice buys something and costs something else. This is what the filtration choice cost: a breach that got found before we wanted it found, one grave under rubble, and a lesson about exactly how thin our margins still are. One of our 2 air filtration technicians, a quiet man named Jung Ho, who'd been running maintenance checks near the outer perimeter when the intruders first triggered the vent alarm, takes a glancing hit from a thrown length of pipe, before Mirei's warning shot from an overwatch position sends the retreating raiders scattering faster. Not a serious wound, a fractured forearm, already set and splinted by Sumin within the hour, but it's the first time someone who works alongside us bleeds because of a decision I made. I sit with him for a few minutes after Sumin finishes setting the bone, mostly because it feels wrong not to, and he tells me, through the kind of pain-thinned half-smile people manage when they're trying to prove they're fine. Guess this makes it real, huh? It already was real, but I understand what he means. There's a difference between knowing something is real and having your own arm confirm it. That evening, Taesu gives me the numbers without me asking, the way he started doing whenever something shifts, not a ritual, not a scheduled report. Just information delivered when it actually means something. "We used 4 of our non-lethal charges triggering that collapse," he says. "Down to 11 on that system. Perimeters solid everywhere else, but that vent gap cost us. If it had been a bigger group or an armed one, we'd have been reacting instead of controlling it. Food and water reserves are still exactly where the plan says they should be at this point, enough for the current headcount past the 6-month mark without rationing. That's the good part. And the bad part? The bad part is that was 4 unarmed civilians who stumbled onto us by accident. We haven't seen what happens when someone comes looking for us on purpose. I don't have an answer for that yet. I don't think there is one. Not until it happens. Mirei calls me down to the security station a little after midnight, and the tone in her voice over the comm is different from anything I've heard from her since she arrived. Not alarmed exactly, but focused in a way that tells me she's already spent an hour convincing herself she's not imagining what she's about to show me. She rewinds the drone footage from the retreat, slows it down, and points to the 3rd raider, the one who didn't run in a straight line like the others, who paused twice during the retreat to look back at specific points along the tree line, angles that line up almost exactly with 2 of our best hidden sensor positions. "Watch how he moves," she says. "The other 3 are just running." "He's not running, he's leaving. There's a difference, and he's the only one doing it." She plays it again. The man's path isn't panic. It's methodical, deliberate, cataloging something as he goes. the way someone moves when they're building a mental map instead of just fleeing for their life. A random drifter doesn't retreat like that, Mireille says. That's someone who knew what to look for before he ever got here. Neither of us says the next part out loud yet, but it sits in the room with us anyway. 4 unarmed strangers stumbling onto a vent by accident is one kind of problem. One of those 4 moving like a trained scout, cataloging sensor positions on his way out, is a different problem entirely, the kind that means somebody, somewhere, already sent him to look. 3 weeks after the door first sealed, I stand in the hydroponics bay and watch Tai-Su cut the first tomato off a vine that didn't exist 2 months ago. It's a small thing. A single tomato, red and unremarkable, held up in a man's calloused hand under grow lights that hum quietly overhead. But I remember exactly what emptiness feels like. I died once with nothing in my hands but a stolen flask of water, and this is the opposite of that memory, concentrated into one piece of fruit. First real harvest, Tai-Su says, turning it over like he's checking it for a flaw that isn't there. Fast-growing root vegetables are already cycling in tank 2. Tilapia in the aquaponic loop are close to their first harvest weight. I don't say anything profound about it. I just nod, and that's enough, because the numbers behind it say everything the moment doesn't need to. The math is simple, and I run it out loud for no one in particular, the way I've started doing when a milestone actually deserves the accounting. Calorie output from the hydroponic and aquaponic systems, once fully cycling, covers roughly 60% of daily nutritional need for our current headcount. The rest comes from the freeze-dried and canned reserve, calculated years ago against exactly this number of people. Combined between what grows here and what's stacked in the storage bay, we're sitting on food security past the 5-year mark without rationing, assuming the headcount doesn't spike beyond what the plan accounted for. It's the kind of number that means nothing on paper and everything in practice. In the life I already lost, I watched people kill each other over a single bag of rice inside the first month. Down here, food isn't a weapon anyone needs to fight over. That difference is the entire point of everything we built before the surface turned into what it's become. The medical bay reaches full operational status the same week, oxygen generator running clean, antibiotic and analgesic stock organized and inventoried, a small surgical suite equipped for anything short of what a full trauma hospital could handle. Su-Min runs it like she's run it for years already, even though the paint on the equipment cases is barely a month old. The crew has grown with the systems. 5 people when the door first sealed, 14 now, and every one of them came in through a decision, not a lottery. 2 additional filtration technicians beyond Jung-Ho, a structural crew lead named Bae Hyun-woo who Tai-Su recruited from his old military contacts, a cook named Yoon Seo-yeon who ran a small restaurant near the mountain before the collapse and now runs meal planning for 14 people on a nutritional budget that has to last years, and a handful of others, each filling a gap the plan always accounted for but never had a face attached to until now. None of them came in blind. Every hire went through the same filter skill, discretion, and a background I could verify wasn't going to become a liability once the door closed behind them. It's slower than just taking whoever showed up first. It's also the only way I know how to build something that survives past the first crisis instead of collapsing under the second one. Su-Min's cynicism isn't quiet, and I've stopped expecting it to be. She runs the medical bay with a bluntness that occasionally puts her at odds with Tai-Su's instincts, and the disagreement that surfaces this week isn't small. A minor injury during perimeter maintenance, nothing life-threatening, a deep laceration on one of the newer technicians eats up more of a specific antibiotic than Su-Min budgeted for that category of injury. Tai-Su, reviewing supply logs the way he reviews everything, flags it. We can't burn through broad-spectrum stock on cuts that could have been handled with basic disinfection and stitches, he tells her, not unkindly, but flatly. That stock needs to last for actual infections, actual emergencies, not every scrape. Su-Min doesn't back down an inch. That scrape was 2 centimeters from a joint. You want to explain to me which infections count as actual before or after someone loses a hand because we rationed the wrong cut too conservatively? I want triage that accounts for scarcity, not triage that treats every injury like it's the only one that'll ever happen. That's exactly what triage is, Tai-Su. You don't get to have both the caution of scarcity and the confidence of unlimited supply. Pick one. Neither of them is entirely wrong, and I don't step in to settle it because I don't think it needs settling. It needs to keep happening over and over, every time resources and judgment collide, because that friction is what keeps either one of them from drifting too far toward a mistake the other would have caught. I let it run its course and note privately that Su-Min doesn't lose these arguments as often as Tai-Su expects her to. The first real information about anyone else out there comes from a traveler. Mi-Ray's perimeter sensors catch 3 kilometers out a thin, sun-damaged man named Oh Jae-min, moving alone, clearly starving, who doesn't even know he's been tracked by sensors until Tae-soo and 2 others meet him on the surface, weapons visible but not raised, and offer him water before anything else. He doesn't ask to come inside. He's too disoriented, too dehydrated, and too far past trusting strangers to ask for anything more than what's already been given to him. But in the 20 minutes it takes Soo-min to stabilize him enough to walk, he tells us something that matters more than his own condition. "There's a place," he says, voice cracked from disuse. "Maybe 40 kilometers east of here. Big. Concrete. Guard towers. The works. Word is, it's the safest shelter left standing this side of the mountains." "You didn't go there," Tae-soo says. "Not a question." "Tried." Oh Jae-min's laugh has nothing funny in it. "They don't let people in unless you've got something they want, skills, supplies, or you're young enough to work." I heard screaming from inside, more than once, late at night, from outside the wall. Nobody who goes in for processing comes back out to tell you what that means. He doesn't have a name for who runs it. He only heard it called by a nickname the locals gave it before most of them stopped talking about it altogether: the vault. Run by a developer, someone with money before the collapse, someone who built it as a business before he ever needed it as a shelter. I don't say anything out loud, but the name that surfaces in my head isn't a guess. Choi Ganuk built exactly the kind of elite bunker I refused to buy into 8 months ago, the kind advertised, the kind with a nickname locals already knew before the world ended, the kind of place where power gets concentrated in the hands of whoever built it and used on whoever needs it most. I file the name away without saying it out loud yet. Some information isn't ready to be spoken until it's ready to be acted on. That evening, after Oh Jae-min is resting in a spare bunk under Soo-min's watch, the mood in the common area is lighter than it's been in weeks the first harvest, the crew settling into something that resembles routine. Even the unsettling news about the vault somehow folded into a night that still manages to feel almost normal. Tae-soo and Mi-Ray end up arguing about tactics again, this time over something almost trivial: whether the false shaft collapse mechanism should be rearmed immediately after every trigger or left disabled for 48 hours to avoid a second cave-in risk while the dust settles. Tae-soo wants immediate rearmament, arguing that leaving the defense down even briefly is an unacceptable window. Mi-Ray argues structural safety, pointing out that a second collapse triggered too soon could bring down more than intended and kill someone on our own side working the site. "You'd rather leave us exposed for 2 days than risk touching the dust for 1 more hour, Tae-soo says, not quite serious, not quite joking either. "I'd rather not have to explain to Soo-min why one of her patients came from our own tunnel instead of a raider," Mi-Ray fires back. "And there's an actual edge under it, but also something that isn't quite an edge, something closer to 2 people who've started trusting each other enough to argue without either one flinching from it." It goes on for a few minutes, sharp and quick. And somewhere in the middle of it, Tae-soo says something dry enough that Mi-Ray actually laughs a short surprise sound, like she wasn't expecting to give him the satisfaction. I'm sitting a little apart from both of them, half listening, half reviewing supply logs on a tablet I've stopped actually reading. For a moment, just a moment, I let myself notice what this actually looks like. 14 people. A harvest. An argument that isn't about survival, just about method, the kind of argument people only have when the basic question of whether they'll live through the week has already been answered. It feels, for exactly as long as I let it, like something close to what other people might call home. I don't let it sit there long. 2 lives is enough to teach anyone that comfort is a debt you don't know the interest rate on until it's already due. I close the tablet, stand, and start walking toward the perimeter monitors instead of staying in the warmth of the room a minute longer than I already did. The alert comes just past 10 the next morning, not a sensor trip, not a drone flag, but a voice, carried faintly through the outer intercom near the surface access point that Tae-soo installed weeks ago, and none of us expected to actually use this soon. 3 voices layered together, none of them raised in threat, a woman's voice cracking, a man's lower, steadier, and under both of them, unmistakable even through static, a child crying. Mi-Ray reaches the monitor first. On the grainy feed, 3 figures stand at the outer gate, a man, a woman, and a girl who can't be older than 7, all 3 of them burned red by sun exposure, all 3 of them clearly out of anywhere else to go. "We saw the smoke from your ventilation stack," the man's voice says through the speaker, thin with exhaustion. "Please, we're not armed. We just need somewhere safe." I stand at the monitor a long moment before I say anything, because I already know this isn't a decision I get to make quickly, and some part of me, the part that still remembers what it felt like to stand at a locked door with nothing left to bargain with, already knows exactly how heavy this is about to get. Their name is Han. Not related to Mirai, I check that within the first minute, an old habit from a life where names meant something before they meant nothing. The father is Han Woo-jin, 36. The mother is Han No, keeps her own name. I catch it a second later, Yoo Ji-eun, 34. The daughter is 7, and her name is Han So-ah, and she hasn't stopped crying since the feed picked them up. I walk to the outer gate myself. I don't send Tae-soo or Mirai to make first contact, because if this is going to be my decision, I'm not going to make it from behind a monitor while someone else stands in front of these people and absorbs whatever it costs to say it. Up close, through the reinforced viewport beside the gate, they look worse than the camera showed. Ji-eun is holding her daughter against her hip even though the girl is old enough to walk. The way people hold on to something when letting go feels like the last thing they have control over. Woo-jin stands slightly in front of both of them, sunburned to the point of blistering across his forearms, and there's a stillness in how he's standing that reads less like calm and more like a body running on the last of whatever it had left. "Please," Ji-eun says before I've said anything at all. "We walked 2 days. We don't have anywhere else." I don't answer that yet. Protocol first, the same protocol every single person who's come through this gate has gone through. No exceptions, because exceptions are how systems die. There's a scan before anyone comes through this door. Radiation, contamination, injury. It's not optional, and it's not about trust. It's about what I owe the people already inside. Woo-jin nods like he expected exactly this. Ji-eun just holds her daughter tighter. The scanner takes 90 seconds per person, and I watch the readouts over Tae-soo's shoulder in the small alcove built into the gate structure. Ji-eun and So-ae both come back clean, dehydrated, malnourished, sun-damaged, but nothing that Sumin's medical bay can't correct within days. Woo-jin's readout is different. Elevated radiation exposure, low enough that it hasn't produced visible symptoms yet, but high enough that Sumin, called in to review the numbers personally, doesn't hedge when she gives me her assessment. "Early-stage radiation sickness," she says, quiet enough that the family can't hear it through the viewport. "Not immediately fatal on its own, but his immune response is already compromised, and if we bring him into a sealed system with 14 other people and limited medical isolation capacity, we're not treating one patient. We're risking an outbreak vector in a population that can't afford to lose anyone to something we let walk through the door." I already know what the math says before she finishes talking. I run it anyway, out loud, because some decisions need to be heard exactly as ugly as they are instead of dressed up as something gentler. "Current reserves support 14 people past 5 years without rationing," I say. 3 more people, clean, is a number the system absorbs without strain. 1 more person carrying an active medical risk that could compromise the isolation ward and, worst case, spread to the rest of the colony. That's not a resource problem. That's a containment problem, and containment problems don't get solved by hoping. Tae-soo, standing near the gate controls, doesn't wait for me to finish laying it out before he cuts in. "So what, we leave him out there? You heard what's happening to people alone on the surface right now?" "I didn't say that." "Then say what you're actually saying, Do-hyun, because right now it sounds like you're weighing a man's life against a supply spreadsheet." I feel that land exactly where he means it to land, and I don't flinch away from it because some part of it is true even if the reasoning behind it isn't wrong. I'm weighing one man's exposure against 14 people's isolation capacity in a facility that has exactly one contamination ward built for exactly one patient at a time. If he gets sicker in there and we don't have room to isolate him properly, I'm not protecting one life. I'm gambling with everyone's. Tae-soo doesn't have an answer to that, not one that survives contact with the actual numbers, but I can see in his face that having an answer was never really the point. He's not arguing logistics. He's arguing something that happened to him once, in a life he doesn't remember living, carrying a child out of a collapsing building instead of a weapon, and dying for it before anyone thanked him. I don't know that memory. He doesn't either, not consciously. But something in him is fighting for this family harder than the math alone explains, and I don't have time to figure out why before I have to decide anyway. I offer the compromise because the alternative, turning all 3 away, or bringing all 3 in and hoping the isolation ward holds, are both worse than what I actually choose. Ji-eun and So-ae come inside. Woo-jin stays outside the gate in the shade of the outer overhang with 2 weeks of water, food, and the small emergency medical kit we can spare without breaching the reserve threshold. "This isn't permanent," I tell him, and I make myself say it directly to his face instead of through Sumin or Tae-soo. Because if I'm the one making this call, I'm the one who says it out loud. "In 14 days we retest. If your exposure levels are dropping instead of climbing, we bring you in properly, with isolation protocols in place by then. This isn't abandonment, it's containment, until containment isn't necessary anymore." Woojin looks at his daughter through the viewport rather than at me. Soa is screaming now, reaching for him with both arms, the sound of it carrying through the gate speaker in a way that doesn't get any easier to hear the longer it continues. "Take care of them," he says, finally, to me, not to Taesu, not to the gate itself. "Whatever else happens, take care of them." I tell him I will. I mean it when I say it. That doesn't make the gate closing between him and his family feel like anything other than what it is. Ji-eun doesn't speak to me for the first 2 days after she comes inside. She lets Sumin treat her and her daughter, lets Yoon Seo-yeon feed them, lets the mechanics of the colony absorb her the way it's absorbed everyone else who's come through. But every time I'm in the same room, she looks at me the way people look at something they've decided to hate on principle, whether or not the principle survives closer examination. I don't try to talk her out of it. There's nothing I could say that would make the distance between her husband and this door feel smaller than it actually is. The perimeter camera catches it on the morning of the second day, not raiders, not organized violence, just heat. Woo Jin, weakened further by 24 more hours of sun exposure on top of an immune system already compromised, doesn't wake up from what should have been a normal rest period in the shade. Tae-soo reviews the footage twice before he brings it to me. And even he, who fought for this man's admission 2 days ago, doesn't have anything left to argue with once the numbers on the screen stop being hypothetical. I watched the footage myself once, and then I don't watch it again. There's a version of this where I tell myself the exposure was already too advanced, that bringing him inside wouldn't have changed the outcome, that the containment math was sound regardless of what happened after. Some of that might even be true. None of it changes what I feel standing in that control room, looking at a still frame of a man who asked me to take care of his family and then died 12 meters from the door I closed on him. I think, for exactly as long as it takes to have the thought and not 1 second longer, about an old man at a subway grate who I hit twice so I could have his spot for the night, and whether the distance between that version of me and this one is as large as I need it to be. I don't let the thought finish. I close the file and I go tell Ji-eun what the camera's recorded because she deserves to hear it from me directly, whatever that costs either of us. She doesn't scream. I almost wish she had screaming would have been easier to absorb than the silence that follows. The way she goes completely still, holding Soa against her chest like she's trying to make sure the girl doesn't hear the words twice. "You did this," she says finally, voice flat, stripped of everything except the accusation underneath it. "You had the room, you had the water, you had everything, and you left him out there because a number told you to." I don't defend myself. There's no version of a defense that would land as anything other than an excuse to someone standing exactly where she's standing. "I made the call that protected everyone already inside, including your daughter," I say. "That doesn't make it not a cost. It doesn't make it not yours to be angry about." She doesn't answer that. She just turns and carries Soe away, and I let her go because there's nothing else the moment can hold right now. Tae-soo corners me later that night in the corridor outside the control room, and this time there's no dry humor in his voice at all. "You made the wrong call," he says, no preamble. "I made the call the math supported." The math isn't the only thing that matters, Do-hyun. You're running this place like every decision is a spreadsheet, and eventually that's going to cost us something the spreadsheet can't explain. "It already did," I say. "A man is dead. I know exactly what it cost." "Then why would you make the same call again?" I don't answer that immediately because the honest answer is that I would, and saying that out loud to a man who's still angry isn't going to make either of us feel better about it. Because the alternative wasn't "nobody dies," I finally say. The alternative was a contamination risk inside a sealed system with 14 people and 1 isolation bed. I don't get clean choices here, Tae-soo. I get choices that cost something no matter which one I pick, and I have to pick the one that costs the least across everyone, not just the one that feels the least like a failure standing here tonight. He doesn't accept that. Not fully, not yet. He walks away without agreeing, and the distance between us doesn't close that night or the next one. It's the first real fracture in something that had started to feel, 3 weeks ago, like it might actually hold together as more than a chain of command. It takes almost a week before Ji-eun says anything to me that isn't cold. It happens by accident, in the medical bay, where I've come to check on a supply count and find her sitting with Soo-min, watching Soe sleep in a real bed for what's probably the first time in weeks. She hasn't had a nightmare in 3 nights, Ji-eun says, not looking at me, but saying it out loud anyway, like she needs to hear herself admit it. First time since before all this started. I don't say anything, because I don't think she's talking to me yet. Not really. "I keep running it," she continues. What would have happened if you'd let all three of us in and Woojin got worse in here? If it spread? If it was so I instead of him? She finally looks at me, and there's no warmth in it. But there's something else now. Something closer to a person forcing herself to see a shape she doesn't want to see. I still think you're the reason he's dead. I don't think I'm ever going to stop thinking that. But I also think if you'd made the other choice, I might have buried both of them instead of one. It's not forgiveness. I don't expect it to be, and I don't ask for it. But it's the first crack of daylight in a week that's been nothing but the weight of a decision I'd make again, and still can't call anything other than heavy. Just past midnight, 6 days after Woo Jin's death, Mirei's overnight watch catches something on the outer sensors that doesn't match anything we've seen before. Not the stumbling, accidental movement of the raiders 3 weeks ago. Not the desperate wandering of refugees looking for high ground. This is a pattern. 3 distinct heat signatures, moving in coordinated intervals, pausing at exact points along the tree line that match our sensor blind spots almost too precisely to be coincidence. Using equipment that registers on Taisu's counter-surveillance sweep as active thermal dampening gear, not something scavenged Mardaughters carry, not something anyone stumbles into by accident. That's not a raiding party, Taisu says, watching the readout over Mirei's shoulder. All the earlier tension between us folded away for now under something that matters more urgently. That's a scouting team. Trained, equipped, and they're not looking for an easy target. Somewhere out there, someone with real resources has already decided we're worth the effort of finding properly. Mirei takes the scout alive. It isn't clean. He fights when the trap closes around him near the tree line, and it takes both her and Taisu to get him restrained without anyone getting seriously hurt in the process. But he's breathing, cuffed, and sitting in a reinforced storage room we never built for this purpose, but adapted within an hour of deciding we needed it. I don't watch the interrogation. Taisu runs it, and I trust him to run it the way it needs to be run, direct, without theater, without cruelty for its own sake. I hear the result of it secondhand, in the control room, less than 2 hours later. His name's Beck, Taisu says, dropping into the chair across from me like the last 2 hours cost him something. Contracted scout. Not military, not government, private. He's been paid to map 3 separate sites in this range over the last month, us included. Paid by who? He gave it up faster than I expected. Guy called Choi Gunnock. Runs a private facility about 40 kilometers east, matches the description that Traveler gave us a few weeks back. The Vault. I don't say anything for a moment because the name lands somewhere I wasn't fully braced for it to land. I knew Choi Gunnock once. Not as an equal. Not as a business rival, as a man who had everything I didn't, in a life where I had nothing at all. He was a developer even then, before the world ended the first time, mid-30s, well-dressed, the kind of man who walked past homeless encampments like they were an inconvenience to his commute rather than people. I remember him specifically because of one night, 8 months before my first death, when I tried to take a bag of food from a delivery driver waiting outside a restaurant Choi was leaving, drunk, laughing with 2 friends. He saw me do it. He didn't call the police. He walked over, took the bag back out of my hands himself, and hit me twice, once to put me down, once more after I was already down, for the audience of his friends who laughed the entire time it happened. Then he threw a folded bill on the ground next to me, not out of charity, but so his friends would see the gesture and call it generous. I picked that money up after they left, because I needed it more than I needed my pride, and that decision sat in me for years afterward like a splinter I never dug out. I don't say any of this out loud to Taisu. I just sit with it for a second, feeling something I haven't let myself feel since I woke up in this life, not the cold, tactical calculation I've run every other decision through, but something older and more personal, closer to a debt I didn't know I still owed until the name came back around. You know him, Taisu says. It's not really a question. I knew him, I say. A long time ago, in a way that doesn't matter to the tactics. What matters is what Baek told you about his shelter. Taisu doesn't push on the first part, not yet, but I can see him filing it away the same way he filed away my silence 3 months ago at that folding chair evening on the surface. Another debt of explanation I haven't paid off. The vault runs on forced labor, Taisu says, moving past it because the tactical picture matters more right now than my history. Beck says Choi took in survivors early, same as we did, but instead of building a team, he built a workforce. People who can't leave, working the facility's systems under threat, rationed just enough to keep them working and not enough to let them get strong enough to fight back. He's been running scouting operations on every other shelter in range for weeks not to help anyone, to find out who's worth taking resources from and who's worth taking as more labor. And us specifically? Beck says word reached Choi about a hidden facility in this range, holding out with full systems running working hydroponics, working defense, a headcount that's grown instead of shrunk. That's rare enough right now that it got his attention personally. I think about the false shaft, the collapsed tunnel, the 4 unarmed drifters who found us mostly by accident weeks ago. None of that reached anyone with the resources to organize a professional scouting team. This is different. This is someone deliberately hunting for exactly the kind of place we built. Because a functioning shelter this deep into the collapse isn't just territory to Choi Ganuk, it's proof that his own model, built on fear and forced labor, isn't the only way to survive this. He's not just going to leave us alone once he confirms what we've got, I say. No, Tae-soo agrees. He's not. The sabotage happens 2 nights later, before we finish deciding what to do about Bayek, or what he told us. Tae-soo catches it first, during a routine water system check-in anomaly in the secondary reserve tank's chemical readout. Trace contamination that shouldn't be there under any natural process. Someone introduced a toxin into the reserve tank's access line, likely during the same window Bayek's scouting team was mapping our perimeter, using an access point along the outer piping run that we hadn't fully hardened yet. The primary water system, the one actively supplying the colony day to day, comes through triple-stage filtration that catches the contamination before it reaches anyone. Nobody gets sick. But the secondary reserve tank, the one meant to buffer us through any extended failure of the primary system, is fully compromised. Its entire capacity rendered undrinkable without a full purge and rebuild of that section of the system. It's not a strike meant to kill us immediately. It's a strike meant to remove our margin, take away the buffer that lets us survive a worse crisis later, so that when the worst crisis comes, we're already thinner than we should be. Tae-soo lays out the resource problem the same night, blunt as always. Full rebuild of the secondary reserve system pulls materials and labor we were planning to use reinforcing the main entrance armor. We still haven't finished that job from day one, remember? We chose filtration over entrance hardening back then, and the door's still not fully plated. If Choi's testing our defenses like this, a real assault might not be far behind, and we'd be facing it with an unfinished door. He doesn't tell me which one to prioritize. He's learned that much from the last decision that fractured us. He lays out the choice and lets me own it. Not because he's given up arguing, but because the argument already happened once, and he's watching to see if I've actually learned anything from the weight of it. I run the same math I've run every time this exact shape of choice has come up. Water first. Even now? Even with an assault possibly coming? An assault is a maybe. Thirst and poison aren't. If that reserve system stays compromised and something happens to the primary line accident, another sabotage attempt, anything, we're out of clean water in days, not weeks, for everyone inside this mountain. That kills faster and more certainly than an unfinished door does. It's the same math as day one. I'm not changing the formula just because the last decision I made under it cost someone their life. The formula wasn't wrong. The circumstances were just uglier than I wanted them to be. Tae-soo doesn't argue this time. Whether that's agreement or just exhaustion from the last fight, I don't ask. The materials and labor go to the water system. The entrance armor stays unfinished again, and I feel the weight of that gap every time I walk past the door now, aware in a way I wasn't 3 months ago of exactly what we're gambling by leaving it that way twice in a row. While the water system repair is underway, Mireille raises something she's been sitting on for 2 days, waiting until she had enough to bring it to me instead of a half-formed suspicion. The contamination point, she says, pulling up a schematic of the outer piping run on the control room display. Access to that specific junction isn't something a scout mapping us from outside could find without help. Someone had to know exactly where that line ran, underground, invisible from the surface. That's interior knowledge. You think someone inside gave it to them? I think it's worth asking who's had access to full facility schematics and also had contact with anyone outside the perimeter in the last month. She doesn't say the name yet, letting me arrive at it on my own, and I do, almost immediately, because there's really only one person who fits both conditions. Oh, Jaemin, the traveler we brought in weeks ago, half dead, thin and starving, who told us about the vault before he'd even fully recovered. He's had run of the lower levels for 2 weeks as he's regained strength, technically supervised, but not watched closely enough to rule out exactly the kind of access Mireille is describing. I don't want it to be him, Mireille says, and there's something almost apologetic in how she says it. But I've been watching the movement logs since you brought him in, and there's a gap 2 nights ago, almost 40 minutes, where his tracker badge shows him near the lower utility corridor, right by that junction, with no logged reason to be there. We don't get the chance to confront him carefully. Mireille and Tae-soo move to bring him in for questioning the next morning, and by the time they reach his assigned quarters, the bunk is empty. The ventilation grate in the back of the small room pried loose from the inside, wide enough for a thin, starved-looking man to fit through if he knew exactly which shafts led back toward the surface. He's gone. Along with him, based on what's missing from the supply closet nearest his room, goes a partial set of facility schematics Tae-soo had printed weeks ago for a maintenance review and never fully secured afterward floor layouts, defensive positions, exactly the kind of blueprint that turns a hidden fortress into a known target. Mireille stands in the empty room for a long moment before she says anything, and when she does, her voice carries none of its usual steadiness. He was never a drifter. He was already Choi's before we ever found him on that sensor sweep. The whole thing, the exhaustion, the story about the vault that might have all been exactly what he wanted us to hear. I stand in that empty room too, looking at the pried-open grate, and I think about how a man who has everything he wants doesn't send scouts and spies for territory alone. He sends them because the existence of something better than what he built is its own kind of threat, and Choi Ganuk, whoever he's become in this life, was never going to leave us alone once he confirmed what we are. He knows the layout now, I say finally. Every weak point, every defensive position. Tae-soo doesn't need me to finish the thought. Then we're not preparing for a maybe anymore. Somewhere 40 kilometers east, a man who once threw a folded bill at my feet for the entertainment of his friends is looking at a map of everything I built to make sure I never had to feel that small again, and deciding exactly how he wants to take it from me. The attack doesn't come through the gate, it comes through the air itself. 4 days after Oh Jae-min disappeared with our schematics, the outer ventilation intake, one of 3 surface vents Tae-soo built specifically to draw fresh air down into the mountain without exposing the main entrance, starts pulling in something that isn't air. Thick, chemical smoke pumped directly into the intake shaft by someone who knew exactly which of our 3 vents to target, because the map that told them was the same one Oh Jae-min carried out through a pried-open grate. The alarm that goes off isn't the one for raiders at the gate, it's the one for atmospheric contamination, and it's worse in a specific way none of us have had to face, yet this isn't an enemy we can shoot at the door. This is an enemy already inside our air. Tae-soo reaches the filtration control room before I do, already running the emergency isolation protocol, sealing the compromised intake shaft off from the rest of the ventilation network before the smoke can spread past the technical corridor it's entering through. The triple-stage filtration system does exactly what it was built to do. The positive pressure sealing Tae-soo tested with Smoke himself back on day 1 holds the line between the contaminated shaft and the living quarters, the hydroponics bay, the medical wing. It isn't perfect. One technical corridor, the section directly connected to the targeted intake, where 2 of the compressor relays live, takes the brunt of it before the isolation seals fully engage. By the time the shaft is sealed and the contamination contained, that entire corridor reads toxic on every sensor we have, and everyone assigned to work near it has to switch to full respirator gear for what Soo-min estimates will be several days, until the air in that section clears enough to test safe again. It's not the whole system, Tae-soo says, breathing hard, still in his mask, checking readouts against the wall panel. It's contained, but we're running 2 compressor relays blind now, through masks in reduced visibility, for however long it takes to clear that corridor. That's the cost. Reduced effectiveness on 2 critical relays, exactly the kind of gap an enemy would want open before a real assault. I don't need Tae-soo to spell out what it means. Choi Ganuk isn't trying to kill us with this attack. He's testing exactly how deep our redundancy goes, and finding out precisely where it thins. The casualty happens in the 2nd hour of the containment effort, not from the smoke directly, but from what the smoke forces us into. Jung-ho, the filtration technician who took a fractured forearm during the first raider incident weeks ago, the one who told me afterward, half smiling through the pain, that it made everything feel real, is one of the 2 assigned to the compromised corridor, working in full respirator gear to manually reroute the compressor relay before the automated system can finish isolating it on its own. He's good at his job. He's been good at it since the day we hired him. But the corridor's structural integrity, weakened by the sudden thermal stress of the sabotage and the emergency seal engaging around it, gives way at a support joint nobody flagged as compromised, a section of ceiling paneling, dislodged by the same seal mechanism meant to protect the rest of the facility, comes down directly onto the relay station where he's working. Tae-soo and the 2nd technician pull him clear within under a minute. It isn't fast enough. By the time Soo-min reaches him, the injuries are already beyond anything her medical bay, even fully stocked, was built to reverse. He doesn't die instantly. That's the part none of us are ready for. He's conscious for almost 20 minutes afterward, and Sumin stays with him the entire time, doing everything short of a miracle, and none of it changes the outcome that was already decided the moment that ceiling section came down. He asks, near the end, if the corridor's clear now if the rest of the system held. Tae-soo tells him yes. It isn't entirely true yet, not fully, but it's true enough. And it's the last thing Young-ho hears before he stops responding. I'm not in the room when it happens. I get there 4 minutes too late, and I stand in the doorway of the medical bay watching Sumin sit back from a table she can't do anything more for. And I don't say anything for a long time because there's nothing that fits the size of what just happened. 14 people became 15 weeks ago when we brought in Ji-eun and Soa. 15 just became 14 again, and the number itself means nothing next to the fact that it's a person who trusted this place enough to say, out loud, with a broken arm and a crooked smile, that getting hurt here finally made it feel real to him. It was real before that. It's real now in a way that costs something none of us get back. Tae-soo finds me later, in the corridor outside the medical bay, and for the first time since the gate decision weeks ago, there's nothing sharp in how he approaches me. I keep running it, he says, not looking at me directly, staring instead at a point on the wall like the answer might be written there. If we'd finished the entrance armor instead of the water system last week, would this have happened anyway? Different vent, different corridor, same outcome? I don't know, I say, because it's the only honest answer I have. Maybe. Maybe not. I've run every version of that math I know how to run, and none of them come back clean. He's quiet for a moment. I was hard on you. After the Han family, I still think you made the wrong call there. I don't know if I'll ever stop thinking that. But I watched you stand in that doorway just now, and you didn't look like a man running a spreadsheet. You looked like someone who's been carrying every one of these the whole time, whether or not you show it. I have been, I say, because there's no point pretending otherwise to the one person who's earned the right to hear it plainly. I don't get to stop and grieve properly every time, Tae-soo. If I do, the next decision doesn't get made in time, and the cost of that is worse than what we just lost. That doesn't mean it doesn't cost me something every single time. It just means I don't get to show it the way you're allowed to show it. He nods slowly, and something in the distance between us, the fracture that sat there since the gate, unresolved, festering under the surface of every clipped exchange since closes. Not completely, not with an apology exactly, but with something more honest than an apology would have been. We bury him properly, Tae-soo says, not just log the loss and move on. We will. The math has shifted, and it shifts in a specific direction neither of us says out loud until Mireille confirms it 2 days later with drone footage that finally puts a number on what we're actually facing. We're no longer the smaller, hidden, outmatched shelter hoping to survive by staying invisible. Choi Ganuk knows exactly where we are now. He's already tested our defenses twice the poisoned reserve tank, the vented smoke, and both times, we held, we adapted, we survived the cost without losing the core of what we built. We've grown to 14 people, then 15, now back to 14 with grief instead of growth attached to the number. But the systems themselves, power, water, air, food, defense, are no longer catching up to what a functioning shelter needs. They match it. In some places, thanks to Tae-soo's redundancy-first design, they exceed it. We're not the underdog anymore, not in raw capability. We're something closer to an equal, standing across from an enemy who's spent weeks probing for a weakness he hasn't found yet, and who's about to stop probing and start committing everything he has. Mireille brings the drone footage to the control room late on the 4th night after Young-ho's death, and this time there's no ambiguity to interpret, no scout to dissect for meaning. The footage shows movement along the road network leading toward the vault trucks, at least 6 of them, converging from 3 different directions over the course of a single day, offloading armed men in numbers that don't match anything a shelter needs for internal security. That's not defensive staffing, Tae-soo says, watching the same footage over her shoulder. That's a strike force being assembled. How long, I ask, before they're ready to move? Mireille studies the footage a moment longer before she answers. Doing the same math, the rest of us are already running privately. Based on the build-up rate, and assuming they're staging before committing everything at once, 3 days. Maybe 4. 4 days, at most, before Choi Ganuk stops testing what we're made of and commits everything he has to taking it from us directly. I look at the two of them, Tae-soo, who buried his anger at me somewhere in a hospital corridor 2 nights ago, and Mireille, who's spent every night since Young-ho's death running perimeter sweeps longer than her shifts require. Like grief for her translates into work instead of words, and I understand, without needing to say it out loud, that whatever fractures existed between any of us before this moment don't matter anymore against what's coming. Then we have 4 days, I say, to make sure that when he commits everything, everything isn't enough. The night before it starts, we eat together in the common area, all 14 of us who are left, and nobody says anything that sounds like a speech. Yoon Seo-yeon cooks more than the ration schedule technically allows, and nobody stops her. Sumin sits next to Ji-yoon, who sits next to So-ah, who's fallen asleep against her mother's arm halfway through the meal, undisturbed by the low conversation around her. Tae-soo and Mi-rae sit across from each other, and for once neither of them is arguing about tactics or triage, just eating. Quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't empty. I don't say much either. At one point, Mi-rae looks over at me and says simply, "We did what we could. However this goes, that part's already true." It's not comfort exactly, it's just fact, stated plainly, the way she states most things. I nod, because there isn't a better answer than agreeing with her. The alarm cuts through it 11 minutes later, not a drill, not a false trigger. Perimeter sensors, all of them, lighting up at once. They come at the main entrance first, exactly where we expected them to, which tells me before anything else that Oh Jaemin gave Choi Ganuk more than just a rough sketch of our position. Heavy cutting equipment, mounted on a reinforced truck bed, grinds against the blast door within the first 20 minutes, the same blast door we left unfinished twice, once for the filtration system, once for the water reserve, and now paying interest on both of those choices at the worst possible moment. Tae-soo's voice comes through the comm flat and fast. Doors holding, but that cutting rig isn't stopping. Estimate 2 hours before it breaches the outer layer if nobody interrupts it. Mi-rae interrupts it. From an elevated position built into the rock face above the entrance, she puts 3 rounds into the truck's hydraulic line before the crew operating it even locates her position. And the cutting rig grinds to a stall, half its arm frozen mid-cut. It buys time. It doesn't buy safety within minutes. Return fire starts walking up the rock face toward her position, and she has to relocate twice in the first hour alone just to stay ahead of it. This isn't the 4 unarmed drifters from weeks ago. These are trained men, paid well, equipped properly, and there are a lot of them. The noise and flash tripwires on the outer approach do their job on the first wave, exactly the way they were designed to 3 separate groups attempting to flank through the tree line, trigger them within minutes of each other, and the resulting chaos, disorientation, and retreat buys the defense almost 20 full minutes before the second wave organizes itself. It's not enough on its own. Choi's forces adapt fast, routing around the known tripwire zones on the second attempt, which means either they're better than the raiders we faced before, or they have a map that tells them exactly where not to step. I already know which one it is. Halfway through the second hour, Tae-soo reports movement toward the false shaft, the same collapse trap that worked perfectly against 4 unarmed drifters weeks ago. It doesn't work this time. "They're not going in," Tae-soo says, watching the feed. "They're standing at the entrance, probing it with a pole before anyone sets foot inside. Someone told them exactly what that tunnel is." Oh, Jaemin again. Every piece of leverage we built specifically to turn a stranger's ignorance against them is worthless against someone who already has the blueprint. The false shaft, useless as a trap now, becomes something else instead. Tae-soo rigs a secondary charge at the collapse point manually, and when 3 of Choi's men finally do commit to clearing it themselves, confident it's already been disarmed, the manual trigger catches them anyway. A variation on the same trick, adapted in real time because the original no longer works as designed. It's not elegant, it's not the plan we built months ago. It's improvisation under fire, and it costs us materials and reaction time we don't have much margin left to spend. But it works 3 fewer attackers, and a message sent that even a known trap isn't automatically safe to walk into. We take a prisoner during the second wave, one of Choi's men, wounded in the leg during the failed shaft assault, unable to retreat with the others. Tae-soo brings him in alive, and what happens next isn't something I watch directly, but I don't pretend it isn't happening either. Tae-soo needs to know troop numbers, remaining equipment, and most urgently whether this is the full assault or a probing wave ahead of something larger. The prisoner doesn't volunteer any of it easily. What Tae-soo does to get it isn't gentle, and it isn't something either of us discusses afterward in detail. I don't ask for specifics. I don't need them to understand what they cost. This is the part of survival nobody puts in the recruitment pitch. It's not villages saved and gratitude earned. It's 2 men in a locked room, one of them bleeding and terrified, doing to each other exactly what a world with no rules left teaches people to do when the only currency left is information and pain. What we learn is enough to matter. This is roughly a third of Choi's total force, a probing wave meant to test our defenses and wear down our resources before he commits the rest. The prisoner also gives up something more specific, the location of a captured scout of his own, one of ours, taken during the tripwire chaos in the first hour, currently being interrogated the same way at Choi's staging position a few kilometers out. We don't get that person back. Not tonight. There isn't a rescue operation to mount in the middle of an active siege, and everyone in the control room understands that without needing to say it, even as it sits there, ugly and unresolved, alongside everything else the night has already cost. The casualty comes during the third wave, closer to dawn, when exhaustion has started working against everyone, equally attackers and defenders, both running on adrenaline that's long since curdled into something heavier. Bae Hyun-woo, the structural lead Tae-soo recruited from his old military contacts weeks ago, is stationed near a secondary defensive position along the eastern rock face, reinforcing a barricade point that took damage during the second wave's assault. A sniper on Choi's side, good, patient, better than the men we've faced so far, catches him exposed for less than 2 seconds while he repositions a support beam. It's enough. He's dead before Mirai, sweeping the same ridgeline from a different angle, can identify and neutralize the shooter's position. There's no time to grieve it properly in the moment. Tae-soo calls it in, flat, professional, the way he has to in order to keep functioning through what's still an active assault, and the defense reorganizes around the gap Bae's death leaves in the eastern perimeter, because that gap doesn't close itself just because someone died creating it. I feel it anyway, underneath the tactical response, the way I felt Young-ho's death underneath everything that had to keep moving forward that night too. 2 names now, 2 people who trusted this place enough to defend it, both gone within weeks of each other. I don't have time to sit with that feeling properly. I file it the way I've learned to file everything that would otherwise stop me from making the next decision in time, and I keep working. Dawn breaks with the third wave, finally retreating, not defeated, not destroyed, just pulling back to regroup. The same pattern Choi's forces have shown all night, testing and retreating, wearing down our resources one wave at a time rather than committing everything at once. Tae-soo meets me in the control room a little after sunrise, and the numbers he lays out aren't good. Noise and flash tripwires were down to 4 intact out of the original 20. Non-lethal collapse charges on the false shaft fully spent, no way to rebuild that trap before they try it again. Ammunition across the board is at roughly 40% of where we started the night. He doesn't soften any of it, and I don't ask him to. 2 dead. 3 more with injuries serious enough that they're out of active defense rotation for at least the next several days. And Choi's remaining force? Based on what the prisoner told us and what we've observed directly, he's still got roughly 2/3 of his total strength staged and untouched. Everything we saw tonight was the probe. He hasn't committed the real number yet. I stand with that for a moment, doing the math the way I've done every piece of math since I woke up in this life, and for the first time since the door first sealed, the numbers don't give me a clean answer. 1 more wave like tonight, Tae-soo says, quiet now, all the earlier professional flatness gone out of his voice, and we won't have anything left to meet it with. Outside, the sun is climbing toward the temperature that used to be unthinkable and is now simply Tuesday. Somewhere a few kilometers east, Choi Ganak is counting his own numbers, deciding exactly when to stop testing us, and commit everything he has to finishing this. I already know it's coming. The only question left is whether what we have left is enough to still be standing when it arrives. Choi Ganuk comes himself. Mirai spots him through a long-range scope during the final wave's opening minutes, standing well back from the front line at first, directing his remaining force from a position he clearly believes is safe. 2/3 of his strength, untouched until now, moving on the mountain all at once, trucks, armed men, heavy equipment, everything he's been holding back through 2 nights of probing attacks. He's committing everything, Mirai reports over the comm, voice tight but steady. No reserve left behind. This is all of it. That single fact tells me more about the man than anything Beck or the interrogated prisoner gave up 2 nights ago. A patient commander leaves something in reserve, always, in case the plan goes wrong. Choi Ganak isn't planning for the possibility that it goes wrong. He's already decided he's won, and he's here in person to make sure he gets to enjoy watching it happen. We have almost nothing left to meet it with, and Tae-soo knows it as well as I do, which is exactly why the plan we build in the 4 hours before dawn doesn't rely on anything we've already spent. It relies on the mountain itself. The mine wasn't just built with 1 collapse trap. That was always the visible layer, the one obvious enough that even 4 unarmed drifters could stumble into it. Underneath that, in the deep structural surveys Tae-soo ran back when construction first started, there's a second system load-bearing points throughout the old mining tunnels that, if triggered in the right sequence, don't just collapse one dead-end branch. They reshape the entire western approach to the facility, funneling anything moving through it into a single narrow corridor that our remaining defensive position can actually hold. We never used it before because using it meant permanently altering our own escape routes and surface access a cost too large to spend on anything less than exactly this moment. Tae-soo spent the last 4 hours rigging the sequence by hand, working almost entirely alone through sheer necessity, because every other set of hands is needed elsewhere. If this works, he tells me just before the wave hits, we don't need every tripwire and every round of ammunition we don't have left. We need them to walk into a corridor that isn't a corridor anymore by the time they're standing in the middle of it. The final wave hits harder and faster than either of the first two, exactly as expected from a force with nothing held in reserve. Heavy equipment pushes against the blast door again, more of it this time, more coordinated. Men move through the tree line in numbers that make the earlier waves look like a rehearsal. Mireille holds the ridge as long as she can, picking off anyone who breaks from cover long enough to give her a shot. But even she is forced back twice under sustained return fire that's heavier and better coordinated than anything the previous waves produced. At one point, a round catches the rock face close enough to her position that fragment spray opens a shallow gash along her shoulder, not disabling, but enough that Sumin, monitoring the medical channel, orders her to fall back and treat it before continuing. An order Mireille argues with for exactly 4 seconds before complying, because even she knows a wound left untreated under sustained fire becomes a liability faster than pride can justify ignoring it. Tae-soo is the one who pays the heaviest personal cost. Positioned near the western tunnel network, manually triggering the load-bearing sequence at precisely the moment the largest cluster of Choi's force commits to the corridor, he takes a round through the upper leg from a shooter. He never sees someone positioned exactly where our own tactical planning assumed nobody could reach. He doesn't go down easily. He finishes triggering the final sequence himself, one hand pressed against the wound, before he lets the second technician beside him pull him back out of the line of fire. By the time Sumin reaches him, he's lost enough blood that his voice has gone thin, but he's alive, and the sequence he triggered has already done what it was built to do. The collapse isn't subtle. Half the western tunnel network comes down at once, a controlled avalanche of rock and old support timber that swallows the corridor Choi's largest cluster of men committed to seconds earlier. It doesn't kill all of them. Some are far enough back to scramble clear, but it cuts the force attacking from that direction by more than half in the span of about 10 seconds. And it does something more valuable than the casualties alone. It breaks the coordination of the entire assault, turning a unified push into scattered, disoriented groups that no longer know which direction is safe to move in. Choi Ganuk, watching from his position further back, doesn't retreat. He pushes forward instead personally, rallying the men still capable of moving. Shouting something Mireille's directional mic picks up clearly enough to relay over the comm something about a broke beggar who got lucky with a hole in the ground. Something about finishing this himself, so his people remember exactly who's actually in control here. He still believes, even now, watching a third of his force buried under rock he never anticipated, that this is a contest of strength he simply hasn't applied enough of yet. What Choi Ganuk doesn't know, what none of his men standing outside our mountain right now know, is that his own fortress isn't as secure as he left it. 2 nights ago, during the failed shaft assault, Mireille recovered something off one of the wounded attackers we captured. A partial internal communications frequency for the vault, scrawled on a card the man carried for emergency contact with his own command structure. Tae-soo spent the hours between the second and third waves doing something with it that had nothing to do with our own defense, directly broadcasting, on a narrow band, into the vault's internal frequency, a message meant for exactly the people Oh Jae-min once told us about. The ones who don't come back out from processing. The ones held there not as guests, but as labor. The message is simple, and it doesn't ask for loyalty or gratitude. It states a fact. Choi Ganuk has taken every armed man he has to attack a shelter 40 kilometers west, leaving the vault's internal security thinner than it has been since the day it was built. We don't know, in the moment, whether anyone inside heard it or believed it, or was in any position to act on it even if they did. It was a bet, not a plan, the kind of bet I've made before with worse odds and less to lose. The confirmation comes almost an hour later, relayed secondhand through radio chatter Mireille intercepts from Choi's own retreating men, panic bleeding through the transmission in a way that has nothing to do with our collapsed tunnel. Something is happening at the vault. The people held there, dozens of them, worked past exhaustion for weeks under threat, exactly the population Oh Jae-min described in a story he probably never expected to matter. This directly have turned on the skeleton security force left behind to guard them, and with the majority of Choi's armed strength still tied up in a collapsed tunnel network 40 kilometers away, there's nothing close to enough force remaining at the vault to put the uprising down before it spreads through the entire facility. Choi Ganuk hears it over his own radio in the middle of directing what's left of his assault against us. And for the first time since Mireille first spotted him through her scope, I watched through the same feed his posture change. Not fear exactly. Something closer to a man realizing all at once that the ground he's been standing on for years was never as solid as he believed it was, and that the thing threatening to take it out from under him isn't the shelter in front of him at all. It's the exact thing he built his own power on, finally collapsing under its own weight the moment nobody strong enough was left to hold it down. He makes his choice fast, pulling back the remainder of his force, abandoning the assault on us entirely, racing to save what's actually his before it's gone completely. He never makes it back in time to matter. We don't get the full account of what happens at the vault until much later, pieced together from radio chatter from Bayek still our prisoner, listening to the same panicked transmissions we are, and eventually, days afterward, from survivors themselves. Choi Ganak returns to a facility already lost, gates breached from the inside rather than the outside, his remaining loyalists overwhelmed by people who had nothing left to lose and had just been handed, however accidentally, the first real chance in weeks to prove it. He doesn't die from a bullet Mireille fires, or a trap Taesu designs, or any weapon that traces back to us directly. He dies inside his own walls, at the hands of people he decided, months ago, were worth less as human beings than they were worth as labor. The exact system he built to keep himself in power becomes the mechanism of his death the moment its foundation force, fear, and nobody strong enough to enforce it, briefly cracks open. I don't feel triumphant hearing it secondhand, days later. I feel something closer to a debt finally settled without my hand directly on the scale, and I'm not entirely sure that distinction matters to anyone except me. At our own gate, the siege lifts within the hour. What's left of Choi's assault force, leaderless and aware their home base no longer exists in any form worth defending, scatters rather than regroups. Mireille, shoulder bandaged, watches the retreat through her scope without taking another shot, because there's no purpose left in it beyond cruelty, and cruelty was never the point of any of this. Sumin finishes stabilizing Taesu in the medical bay an hour after the last attacker disappears from the perimeter. The wound is serious, he'll be off his feet for weeks, walking with a limp for longer than that, but he's alive, awake, and irritated mostly about being told to stay still. I stand at the entrance afterward, looking out at a landscape scarred by 2 collapsed tunnel systems, spent tripwires, and the kind of silence that only exists after violence has finally stopped rather than paused. Bae Hyun-woo is still dead. Jung-ho is still dead. Woo Jin is still dead. 3 deaths this mountain carries whether or not the siege that just ended went in our favor. I don't let myself pretend those costs balance out against a victory, because they don't. They're just what the victory happened to cost, paid before we knew the final total. But for the first time since I woke up in this life with $200 and a memory of a fight nobody else believed in, I'm not standing here as someone who survived. I'm standing here looking at a fortress 40 kilometers east that no longer has anyone running it, full of people who have nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose, and I understand, clearly and without romanticizing it, that I'm the only person within 100 kilometers who currently has something worth offering them instead of nothing. I don't know yet what that means practically. I only know that for the first time in 2 lives, the question in front of me isn't how to survive what's coming. It's what to build with what's left. The survivors from the vault start arriving on foot 3 days after Choi Ganak dies inside his own walls, and none of them arrive the way Bayek or the raiders did, armed, testing, looking for a weakness. They arrive the way people arrive when they've run out of every other option and have nothing left to offer as leverage except themselves. I don't let all of them in immediately, and I don't apologize for that, not even to myself. The math hasn't changed just because the enemy who taught it to me is dead. Every person who comes through this gate is still a claim against water, food, and space that has to support everyone already inside it, and letting emotion override that math is exactly the mistake that got a man named Woo Jin killed outside this same door months ago. What's changed is the calculation itself, not the fact that I still run one. Most of them worked under threat, not by choice, Taesu says, still walking with a cane weeks after the injury that nearly cost him the leg entirely, standing beside me at the gate as we process the 3rd wave of arrivals from the vault. Skilled people, some of them. Choi didn't care what they were good at before he broke them into labor engineers, medics, farmers. He just cared that they worked. That's the calculation that's changed. Survivors are rare enough now, months into a collapse that's killed the overwhelming majority of everyone who was alive when it started, that every functioning adult with a real skill is worth more as a contributor than they'd ever cost as a mouth to feed, provided they're willing to become part of something instead of just taking from it. 3 of them stand out within the first week, not because I go looking for standouts, but because competence has a way of surfacing on its own once people are given room to use it instead of being punished for it. Ryu Han-sol, mid-40s, was an irrigation engineer before the collapse, forced at the vault to maintain water systems for a facility that gave him barely enough food to keep functioning. Within 2 days of joining our hydroponics team, he identifies an inefficiency in our aquaponic nutrient cycling that Taesu's original design never caught, and the fix he proposes increases our tilapia yield by nearly a fifth. He doesn't ask for recognition. He asks quietly if there's a place he can actually sleep without someone checking whether he's still breathing every 4 hours. There is now. Kwon Mi-ok, late 20s, was a combat medic before everything fell apart, conscripted into treating Choi's guards first and everyone else only if supplies allowed it. Sumin, still stretched thin, managing the medical bay largely alone since Young-ho's death months ago, takes one look at Mi-ok's actual competence during a triage drill and doesn't hesitate for even a day before formally bringing her onto the medical team. And Jang Do-il, early 30s, quiet almost to the point of unsettling, was a former security contractor before the collapse, forced by Choi into enforcing exactly the kind of control over other prisoners that Do-il clearly hated every day he did it. He doesn't ask to join our defense team. He asks, first, if there's some other way he can be useful that doesn't involve holding a weapon over people again. Mirai, of everyone, is the one who eventually convinces him otherwise, not by pushing, but by explaining plainly the difference between a weapon used to control people and one used to make sure nobody else's family goes through what his did. He joins the perimeter team 2 weeks later. Nobody makes him carry more than he's ready to carry. The last real military threat we face isn't Choi's remnant force regrouping. That force scattered the day their leader died and never reconstituted into anything coordinated enough to matter. It's a much smaller problem. Opportunistic raiders, 5 of them this time, drawn by rumors already spreading through the surviving population about a shelter that beat the region's most feared warlord and is now, somehow, still standing and still growing. They approach the mountain the same way the original 4 drifters did months ago, cautiously, testing the perimeter, looking for a weak point. They don't find one. Mirai's overwatch position identifies them within minutes of their approach. The outer sensor grid rebuilt and expanded since the siege, no longer running on the thin margins that let Oh Jae-min slip past unnoticed tracks every step of their advance in real time. Taesu, still favoring his injured leg but fully capable of directing defense from the control room, coordinates a response that ends the entire encounter in under 10 minutes, with 2 warning shots fired and 0 casualties on either side, because the raiders take one look at coordinated defensive fire from positions they never even identified and decide the mountain isn't worth whatever they came looking for. I watched the readout afterward with Taesu, and neither of us says much because the contrast speaks for itself. 5 months ago, 4 unarmed drifters testing a gap in our camouflage cost us a life and exposed a real weakness in the system. Now, 5 opportunists testing the same mountain don't even get close enough to matter. Absorbed by a defense grid built on months of hard-earned lessons, redundant systems, and a team that stopped being 3 people improvising and started being an actual organization. That's the whole arc, condensed into 10 minutes and 2 warning shots. We're not the ones scrambling to survive an ambush anymore. We're the ones who make ambushes not worth attempting. The settlement forms faster than any of us planned for, mostly because it doesn't need much planning. It forms out of necessity, the same way the original crew came together months ago, one function at a time. A rough perimeter of smaller structures starts appearing on the mountainside above the main entrance, built by former vault survivors and a handful of other refugees who found their way to us since word spread. Housing, mostly not luxurious, but solid, thermally regulated using the same geothermal principles Taesu designed for the core facility, scaled down and simplified enough that people without his exact expertise can maintain them. Labor gets distributed according to actual skill and actual need rather than force. Ryu Han-sol trains 2 others on irrigation maintenance, so the responsibility doesn't rest on one person alone. Kwon Mi-ok starts a basic medical training rotation, teaching enough first response skill to a handful of residents that Sumin and her aren't the only 2 people capable of stabilizing an injury if something happens to both of them at once. Yoon Seo-yeon expands meal planning to cover a population that's grown past 30 now, coordinating with the hydroponics team on exactly what to plant next based on what the growing community actually needs. We form something that functions almost like a council, though nobody calls it that formally at first. Tae-soo handling defense and infrastructure, Mi-rae handling security and threat assessment, Sumin handling medical policy, and myself handling the parts that don't fit neatly into any other category. Who gets admitted, how resources get allocated across a population that keeps growing, and what this place is actually supposed to become now that survival alone isn't the only question left to answer. The rules we settle on are simple, and deliberately nothing like the ones Choi Ganuk ran his own facility by. Work gets you a place here, not fear. Skills get valued regardless of what someone did to survive before they arrived, as long as they're willing to contribute honestly now. Nobody gets held here against their will, and nobody gets punished for asking to leave, though almost nobody does. Ji-yoon approaches me near the end of the second week, so, trailing a few steps behind her, noticeably less thin than she was months ago, noticeably less afraid of the tunnels she used to flinch through on her way to the medical bay. "I heard what you did," Ji-yoon says. Not warmly, not with the coldness of the first weeks either, somewhere in between, a place I've learned to accept as the honest outcome of what happened between us. At the vault, what you started with the broadcast. It wasn't for them, I say, because it wasn't. Not entirely. It was a calculated risk against Choi's numbers, one that happened to also free dozens of people who deserved better than what they'd been given. I don't want her crediting me with more compassion than actually went into that decision. "I know," she says. "That's not really the point. The point is it worked, and now there are people here who wouldn't be alive otherwise, whether or not that was the plan." She glances at So-ae, who's found something interesting in the dirt near the new housing structures and is entirely uninterested in the conversation happening above her head. I still think about Woojin every day. I don't think that's going to stop. But I think I finally understand the difference between someone who's cruel and someone who's just carrying more weight than anyone should have to carry alone. She doesn't say it's forgiveness. I don't ask her to. It's enough standing there, that the distance between us has become something we can both stand inside without it collapsing on either of us. I find myself standing at the edge of the growing settlement in the evening, a little apart from the activity below housing frames going up, Ryu Hansol arguing good-naturedly with one of his new trainees about irrigation timing, So-ae chasing something across the dirt with two other children who arrived in the last week's intake, Tae-soo sitting with his bad leg propped up, still directing work from a folding chair because sitting still entirely was never going to happen for him. 31 people now. A functioning settlement instead of a hidden bunker. Systems that grew past what any single person built alone into something that keeps running and keeps growing even when I'm not the one making every decision inside it. I think about a subway grate on Jongno 3-ga, and an old man I hit twice for the warmth of a spot I didn't deserve any more than he did. I think about a flask of water and 4 men with nothing left to lose. I don't dwell on either memory long enough for it to hurt the way it used to. I just let the distance between that version of me and the one standing here now register, plainly, without dressing it up as anything more profound than what it actually is. For the first time in 2 lives, I'm not responsible only for myself. I'm responsible for 31 people who chose, each of them, to trust that this place would be better than whatever they were running from. That's not a victory speech. It's just a fact, standing quietly at the edge of a mountain that used to be a hole in the ground nobody thought was worth a second look, and now isn't. I go back down to help with the housing frames before the light fails completely. There's still work to finish before dark. 6 months after the siege lifted, I stand at the same overlook where I watched the settlement take its first shape, and the view doesn't look like a hole in a mountain anymore. It looks like a place people live. I don't open with a speech about how far we've come. I never was much for speeches, in either life. I just stand there for a moment, doing the same thing I've always done, counting what's actually in front of me instead of what I wish were there. There's a version of this story that starts with a flask of half-empty water and 4 men who decided that was worth killing for. I lived that version once, all the way to the end of it, face down in an alley with rebar still in someone's hands and my own blood already cooling faster than the air around it. I think about that alley sometimes, still, though less often than I used to. Not because it doesn't matter anymore, but because the distance between that moment and this one has gotten long enough that revisiting it feels less like a wound and more like a marker, a place I started, not a place I'm still standing. Water isn't a weapon here. Nobody in this settlement has killed another person over a bottle of it in 6 months, because nobody has to. The reservoir system runs at full triple filtration capacity, drawing from 3 independent sources exactly the way it was designed to from the beginning. And the number that used to matter more than any other number in my life, how much water is left, how many people are drinking it, how many days until it runs out, isn't a countdown anymore. It's just an entry in a maintenance log Ryu Hansol checks every morning out of habit, not fear. That's the whole arc, if I had to say it in one sentence instead of 13 parts of it. I went from a man who died over a liter of water to a man who built a system where water stopped being something worth dying over. I don't say that out loud to anyone. Some things don't need to be said to be true. Taesu walks without the cane now, though the limp never fully left him, a permanent reminder written into how he moves that he carries without complaint and without hiding it either. He spends most of his days training now not just perimeter defense drills, though those still happen twice a week, but a broader kind of teaching. Taking the newer arrivals like Zhang Do-il and showing them not just how to hold a position, but how to think through the math of a threat before it arrives instead of reacting to it once it does. He's good at it in a way I don't think he expected to be, patient with people learning something for the first time, in a way he wasn't always patient with me during the early months. I asked him once, not long ago, if he still thinks I made the wrong call with the Han family, all those months back. He doesn't answer immediately, which tells me more than a quick answer would have. I think you made the call that kept this place alive long enough to become what it is now, he finally says. I don't know if that makes it right. I've stopped needing it to be right to understand why you made it. That's about as far as I've gotten, and I think that's probably as far as I'm going to get. It's not absolution. I don't need it to be. It's an honest answer from a man who fought me hardest on the one decision that still costs both of us something, and honesty is worth more to me now than agreement ever was. Mireille runs the defense rotation jointly with Taesu now, though her role has shifted since the siege in ways that go beyond just tactics. She's the one new arrivals get assigned to first, not because she's the friendliest face in the settlement she isn't, and she'd be the first to admit it, but because she understands, better than almost anyone else here, what it means to survive completely alone and then have to relearn how to exist as part of something larger than yourself. I watch her, some evenings, sitting with a small group of newer residents near the settlement's central fire pit. Not saying much, just present. The way someone sits with people when the sitting itself is the point rather than whatever conversation happens on top of it. She was a woman who died alone on a stretch of collapsed highway in a life that no longer exists anywhere except in my memory. In this one, she's someone 30-odd people now count on, and count as one of their own in return. I don't think she'd call that healing exactly if I asked her. She'd probably just call it work worth doing. I've learned not to push past what people are willing to call things themselves. Ji-eun runs part of the settlement's education effort now, teaching the handful of children here among them, 7 of them total as of the last count, not just basic literacy and arithmetic, but something closer to how to think clearly under pressure, lessons built from exactly the kind of world these children are growing up in, rather than the one that used to exist before any of them were born. So, A doesn't remember much about the day her father stayed outside the gate. She was young enough that the memory has softened into something closer to a story she's been told, rather than a wound she carries directly, which is its own kind of mercy, even if nobody engineered it that way on purpose. She calls Sumin auntie now, unprompted, the way children attach themselves to whoever's kind and consistently present in their lives, and Sumin, for all her clinical bluntness with everyone else in this settlement, never once corrects her. Ryu Hansol has a small house near the hydroponics bay he helped redesign, shared with 2 of the other former vault survivors who came in around the same time he did. Kwon Mioke runs medical training now alongside Sumin, competent enough that the settlement's healthcare no longer depends entirely on one person being available at any given moment. Zhang Do-il still carries a weapon on perimeter duty, but he also, without anyone assigning it to him, started teaching a handful of the settlement's children basic self-defense, not combat. Just enough awareness and confidence that they're not helpless if something ever does go wrong. Nobody asked him to do that. He just started and nobody stopped him because it fits exactly the kind of place this has become. We don't hear anything more about rival shelters, rival warlords, anyone building the kind of power Choiganuk tried to build on fear and forced labor. That doesn't mean nothing else exists out there in a world this scarred. It almost certainly does, somewhere, in some form. But it isn't close enough to matter to us anymore, and I've stopped scanning the horizon every single day for the next threat the way I did in the first months after the siege ended. That shift, more than anything else, is what tells me this part of the story is actually finished. Not because the world became safe, it didn't, and I'd never claim it did, but because the specific fight this place was built to survive is over, decisively, and what's left now is the ordinary, unglamorous work of keeping 31 people fed, housed, and functioning, one day at a time, which is its own kind of victory even if it doesn't look like one from the outside. I think sometimes about the man I was before any of this, the one who hit an old man twice for a spot by a subway grate, who stole food from people with even less than he had, who died angry and empty-handed over a flask of water that wasn't even his to begin with. I'm not going to stand here and claim I've become someone unrecognizable from him. Some of that man is still in me. I made choices in this life that cost people their lives. Woo Jin outside a gate he never made it through, decisions weighed in spreadsheets that happened to be right and still felt like something closer to cruelty in the moment I made them. I don't pretend those choices were painless, and I don't pretend they were free of the same cold calculation that used to serve only my own survival, and now serves everyone standing in this settlement instead. The difference isn't that I became good. I'm not sure good was ever really the destination I was walking toward. The difference is narrower than that and more honest. I chose, deliberately every single time it mattered, not to become the version of myself that died in an alley for nothing, clutching a stolen flask that wasn't worth what it cost. I chose to build something instead of just surviving inside whatever was left standing. That's not a redemption arc in the way stories usually tell them. There's no moment where the universe forgives me, no scene where the weight lifts completely and I feel clean. I still carry Woo Jin, I still carry Jung Ho and Bae Hyun Woo, and I probably always will. But I also carry 31 people who are alive right now, fed, housed, and building something that didn't exist 8 months before the world tried to end for the second time, and I've decided that carrying both of those things at once is simply what it means to have done this the way I did it. Night falls the way it always does now. Fast, brutal heat giving way to a darkness that used to terrify everyone in the first months of the collapse, and has since become just another part of the daily rhythm we've built our lives around. I climb the ridge above the main entrance one more time before I head back down for the night, the same overlook I've used since the settlement first started taking shape below it, and I look out at what used to be nothing but scarred, empty mountainside. Lights are on across the settlement now, not many, not bright by the standards of the world that existed before any of this, but real, steady, powered by a system Taesu designed and rebuilt and expanded almost entirely with his own hands. Small windows glowing warm against a landscape that, everywhere beyond the edges of what we built, is still dark, still scorched, still exactly as unforgiving as it's been since the day the temperature first started climbing. I don't have a closing line ready. I don't need one. I just stand there for a while, looking at those lights against everything they're surrounded by, and then I turn and start walking back down toward them, because there's still work to do before the night is over, and because, for the first time in 2 lives, that work is something I get to walk toward instead of something I'm running from. The mountain holds 31 people tonight. Tomorrow, if the settlement keeps growing the way it has, it might hold more. That's enough of an ending for me.